So, Mesdames, Messieurs, délégués de conférence, bonjour. I'm Maryn McKenna. I am a member of the program committee of this conference, a board member of the Association of Healthcare Journalists in the US, a columnist for Wired magazine, and the author of a couple of books on science and public health. And I am thrilled to have so many people here. Thank you so much. I know there are many competitive, excellent sessions in this slot, but I'm thrilled to have you all here to talk about writing and publishing books about science now in the 21st century with all the competing demands on our readers' and audience's time. These three brilliant authors and an equally brilliant editor are going to talk to you about that. Their long bios are in the conference program, so I'm not going to recite them for you, but let me introduce them briefly. They managed to sit in the exact order that I have them in my iPad, which was very kind of them. So right next to me is Thomas Abraham of Bangalore, who was previously faculty at the University of Hong Kong, editor of the South China Morning Post, and author most recently of the book Polio, The Odyssey of Eradication. Then Christie Aschwanden of the United States, formerly of the site 538, who's just published a book, Good to Go, about sports science, was a New York Times bestseller. Next to her is the very distinguished Professor Dr. Rana Dajani of the Hashemite University in Jordan. You must especially read her bio because she has many more awards and positions than I could ever recite, and she's author of the book 5 Scarves, Doing the Impossible. And at the very end of the road, David Bamford of the Little Brown Book Group in London, who acquires nonfiction books about science and other topics across a range of imprints with that publisher. So we're going to begin with each of the authors telling us in a brief description about their books. Thomas, let's start with you.
Thank you, Maryn. And thank you all for being here. So lovely. You know, writing a book is a long, lonely, and frustrating process. And the payoff is seeing people like you here and being able to talk about it. So thank you so much for being here. This is a book. The book is Polio, The Odyssey of Eradication. And it's a book about one of the most ambitious things that human beings can do. And that is to end a disease by driving to extinction the virus or the bacteria or the pathogen that causes the disease. And if you think about this, in the case of polio, you're talking about driving to extinction a tiny strip of genetic material. Just think about that. And we, the human race, we've driven large species, all sorts of things to extinction. But here we're willfully trying to drive to extinction a strip of genetic material. And to me, I found that fascinating. I mean, this is this is a moonshot. This is landing man on the Mars. I don't know how many of you were there in an earlier session this morning on space exploration. But to me, this is as technically complex, challenging, and ambitious. It tells you something about human beings and human society, that we would think of doing such a thing. So this was the first thing that I really found interesting about this book. It is about this very ambitious, audacious human project to end a disease in the most difficult but the most permanent way possible. I started writing it. I'm a journalist by profession, and so I think asking questions tends to come naturally. And as I dove into this, it started off as being a feel-good book about all the wonderful things that human beings can do. But questions started to arise. The WHO, the World Health Organization, and its members, which is basically all the nations in the world, decided in 1988 to eradicate polio by the year 2000. We are now in 2019 and counting, and the disease still exists. So the book also quickly turned into something else. It became like the Sherlock Holmes story about the dog that didn't bark in the night. This is also the story of the virus that refused to go away. I've also been fascinated about the wider relationship between man and microbes, right? Because this is one of the oldest relationships that the human species has had. And it's shaped us in so many different ways that we don't quite understand. So that was part of what drove me to write this. This is about the relationship between mankind, and viruses, between two living forms, though virologists would actually argue, they still debate about whether a virus is living or not. So there's that as well. This is also a story about global public health. So now we're moving, the virus moves from the natural world into the social and political world. It's about organizations like the WHO, about the Gates Foundation, the US CDC, which run these enormous global health programs to rid the world of disease, reduce the burden of disease. It's about the politics of that. It's about how different nations and different societies deal with disease. It is about how the poor and marginalized people across the world, how they see disease, how they see efforts like the global polio eradication campaign. So it's about, it was about all of these things. It's about this continuing story. So it started as a very different kind of book. It started really as this great achievement that mankind, one of humankind's greatest achievement, we've got rid of one more disease. It moved on to become something much more complex, much more interesting, and much more reflective of the world as it really is. So I think I'll stop and move on.
Okay, Christie, how about you?
Yeah, so my book is about the science of exercise recovery. And I'll just say that I practically fall asleep just saying that sentence. It sounds really boring to me. But the book is much more interesting than that. It's actually, it's a science book masquerading as a sports book. And it was an opportunity for me to sort of indulge in this obsession of mine. I think all writers have obsessions. And for me, for quite a long time now, my obsession has been the scientific method, methodology, statistics within science. And so this book is really a book that aims, I think that my ambition with the book was to teach the general population how to assess scientific claims, but also to explain to them how science is done, how we know what we know, how we understand the world around us. And I really hope that people who read the book will walk away being better able to assess scientific claims that are thrown at them, whether or not they have to do a sports science or not. And so often what I found in investigating, I basically investigate all of these products and techniques and things that are marketed towards athletes. I have a chapter about hydration and sports drinks. There's a chapter about nutrition, icing. I have an entire chapter on placebo effect, of course. But I think that, at the end of the book, I hope that people will be able to understand that so often when science is used to sell products, science is used to sort of give a veneer of legitimacy to claims that don't hold up very often, and so it sort of walk people through that. So there's a lot of debunking in the book, but I hope that there's also a lot of teaching about the scientific process and just the role of uncertainty too, and the fact that sometimes we can assess claims and make decisions in the face of imperfect evidence, and how do you do that? So I think that's all I'll say. I'll give someone else a try.
Rana.
All right, when I introduce myself in my book, as you can see, my book is called 5 Scarves. People think, what does the scarf represent? And actually what it represents to me in the context of my book is that I play 5 roles in my life. And in English we say, when you play a role, you say you wear different hats. But I don't wear a hat, I wear a scarf. So I called it 5 Scarves. And literally, I actually got 5 scarves. So the first scarf that I write about is that I'm a mother, I'm a parent. And many people don't identify themselves publicly as an asset, that I'm a parent and I have 4 children. And to me, that's the most important role I could play as a human being for the species in producing the next generation, a good generation that will make a difference in this life. The second scarf that I wear is that I'm a teacher, I'm an educator. Actually, I was a school teacher for 10 years before I went and did my PhD and became a scientist. And even today at the university, we are educators as much as we are scientists. And I think the second most important role any human being can play is actually being a teacher. Because, our children spend the second half of their life, if it's not with their parents, it's with their teacher in school. So my hat off to every teacher or has been a teacher, because you learn exactly what are the challenges that children, administrators, and parents face in terms of preparing the next generation to solve the problems we're facing today. The third scarf is that I am a scientist. And I'm a molecular biologist. I actually do research in two fields. I write about them in the book. One is I work on genetics of ethnic populations in Jordan. We work on complex diseases, diabetes in particular, and we're the world experts on these two populations. They are the Circassians and the Chechens, who actually originated from southern Russia and were forced out of their regions 150 years ago. They were persecuted for their religion, and they moved south, and many of them settled in Jordan. The second field of research that I work on is trying to identify and explore the patterns of signature of trauma on epigenetics. Can grandmothers who've been experiencing war actually transfer that epigenetic signal of the trauma that they experience to their children and to their grandchildren? And since I come from Jordan, where actually I'm half Palestinian, my father is from Jerusalem and my mother's from Aleppo, Syria. So I'm half Palestinian, half Syrian with a Jordanian passport, as many, many Jordanians are. And so because we're in this central position in the Middle East, we have a lot of refugees. And that's why I've taken this as to be my research project. And actually it's a testimonial that you could do good research, international research, even if you're in a developing country with limited resources. It's all about asking the right question at the right time. My fourth scarf is that, that's two, yeah, is that I'm a social entrepreneur. I started a program called Wheel of Reading to encourage children to read for fun, because when children read, they become change makers themselves and gain the courage to be the change they want to see. My fifth scarf, usually I don't tell anybody what it is, and I invite them, if they're really curious, to read my book. But I know I'm going to tell you exactly what it is to encourage you to read it. So this one actually came 2014. I got an email from an organization based in Britain, and they had chosen me as one of 20 most influential female scientists in the Islamic world. Now, when they say Islamic world, that's 1.6 billion people. So that's a lot. So I was like, oh my God, this is like an honor, but a huge responsibility. And I was scrolling down in the email to find out more. And they had given actually each one of us a title that represents what they're doing in the world, how they're influential. And I was scrolling down to find out, what is my title? You know, I do so many things. So there was the mathematician for others, somebody was a cardiologist. And as I was scrolling down, I found out that they had called me, you're not going to believe this, they called me the Islamic feminist. And I said, no, you can't do that, right? Because and let's be honest, when somebody hears Islamic, everybody's going to say, oh, I wonder what she's about. And then in the Eastern world, when they hear feminists, they wonder, oh, what is she about? So I ended up, nobody's going to really like me. And so I emailed them immediately and said, could you change it? I do so many other things, but they refused. So it was kind of that call that made me write the book, because I wanted to claim that label and redefine it according to my own terms. So you'll find out how I did that in my book.
David.
Hello.
I'm going to ask you to back us out a little bit, if not 30,000 feet, then a little bit higher than these three. So I'd like to hear about books you've edited, but I'd also like to hear your thoughts on sort of what the landscape is for books about science right now.
Yeah, hi. So I work for Little Brown UK, which is a London-based publisher, which is part of Hachette UK. And Hachette UK represents just under 20% of British publishing, but we also distribute all over the world and have offices in Australia, New Zealand, India. And I edit, as Maryn says, a wide range of literary non-fiction books, including Maryn's wonderful book, Plucked, which she's far too modest to tell you about herself, which is about the use of antibiotics in agriculture, told through the story of chicken. I've also published Alan Schwartz, the New York Times journalist's book on ADHD. And just last month, we published Steve Jones, the geneticist from UCL, his book, which is actually, it's about the sun, about how all processes on Earth that are dependent on and relate to the sun. But it's interesting, Christie, you said that your book is masquerading as a sports book. And I think we see in the market a lot of books that don't, on the face of it, look like science books. And I think that's a healthy thing for science and for non-fiction publishing in general. So Steve's book has a lot of memoir in it, and also a lot about climate change. And we're also seeing comedians writing books that are essentially science books. There's a book comes out next month, the month after, by Sarah Pascoe, the British comedian, and it's basically a biology book. And I think that it's really interesting that people who, it's easy for a comedian to write a memoir and sell loads of copies, but the fact that she's doing something different and trying to push ideas is great. It's really interesting for publishing. In terms of topics, I think we're finally seeing the public take an interest in climate change, which hasn't happened. Maybe it's too little, too late, but lots and lots of books about plastics at the moment, and none of them there isn't a single one that's broken through, but there's a real urge in publishing, and I think that stems from David Attenborough and Science on TV. If you look at the sales figures across the UK market, TV books, TV personalities make up the best-selling books, particularly Attenborough and Brian Cox, which could be seen as depressing for those of us trying to launch new voices and interesting ideas, and people just buy the books from TV. But if we're springing on the back of those books with new books about plastics, for instance, I think that's there's a real opportunity there.
So I'm going to go down the row one more time, and then we're going to mix it up a bit. So, Rana, I'm going to start with you this time. I think all of us have had the experience of having someone who is not an author say to us, "Oh my God, a book. A book is huge. I could never do a book." Probably 5 people have said that to me in just the first day of the conference when they were debating whether to come to this session or not. I know some of you are out there. Thank you for coming. So given that a book is an enormous task laid on all the other things we have to do in our lives, what made you want to do this book? Was there any one sort of inciting moment that really sparked this for you?
So actually, I read a lot. I'm a reader, and I read in diverse topics. And then having been labeled that Islamic feminist and wanting to redefine that, I did many interviews with many women and men around the world, trying to understand how they define success and what it means to them. And I compiled all this information, and I wanted to share it with the world, because what I found out is that we share so many things around the world, and I wanted to highlight that unity and diversity at the same time. And all I could read around in the literature were books written from a Western perspective by particular people. So there wasn't a diversity out there in the literature. So I thought I had something that was new, a new voice, not just that I come from the Middle East, but as a Muslim, as a female, as a scientist. So that I was representing a lot of diversity. So, and I wanted to share in the conversation, be a voice, to talk about my perspective about women around the world. And in the end, it ended up not just on women, but actually on men, on humanity in general. So I wanted to be part of that. And so that's one reason. The other reason is that what I found out is that if we don't write about different perspectives, especially coming from my background, somebody else will write about us. And we can't guarantee what they're going to write about, right? And we can't blame them either. We, whoever we are who want to fill that void in diversity, have to step up and start writing, to present ourselves and to be at the table equally presenting our opinion. And also, I felt a responsibility towards the young generation in the non-Western world to be a role model, to write about my story for them to see it. Because again, when we read about women scientists or even science, there's always, as it was mentioned earlier today and yesterday, there's only one kind of stereotype. And I wanted to show another kind of role model to encourage young people in non-Western contexts, women and others, that yes, you can be a scientist, or you can pursue your passion, and you can find your dream, and they can, they're familiar with me, they can identify with me that, oh, wait a minute, she looks like me. If she was able to do it, then I can. So I think that kind of responsibility. And lastly, also for the Western audience, because there's whether we like it or not, whether we want to admit it or not, there is a stereotype. There's Islamophobia, there's Orientalism, there's a lot of this going around. And unless, again, somebody comes up and speaks which is really very different from what the media, the media has its own agenda of painting what is a Muslim, what is a woman, what is somebody coming from the Middle East. And I wanted to have a voice in saying, no, wait a minute. This is the real person. Read about who we really are to counter that narrative in the media. And then when people read it, they can say, wait a minute, I don't believe that story in the media because I've met the real person. And I think we need that to have an equal conversation around the table, especially that now with the increase in refugees around the world, every European country, every Western country has people who look like me, who talk like me, who represent me. And in order for everybody to be integrated together, they need to know about each other and read about their narratives. So for that, I think we need, and I just want to add one last point. There's a lack of representation of the history of different parts of the world in the Western narrative. And that's why my book is also about science, right? And the history of science. I was reading an article, and this is in Nature, 2 or 3 years ago. You know that Nature has an Outlook version that comes every few months. And of course, they told me that they have nothing, they don't control what's in the Outlook. So this is like a disclaimer, right? But in that particular Outlook, it was all about the history of medicine and nature. And they had this beautiful infograph showing a path or the trajectory of history of medicine. They started with Greek, and then they jumped to the 15th century. And they skipped everything that was done from the Islamic civilization, from identifying the heart circulatory system to the surgical instruments to everything. And I emailed them. I said, "You're Nature." I thought they were responsible, and I said, "You have a responsibility to be authentic to the history, to write everything." And of course, they said, "Oh, they're not responsible." And this was just, they were trying to simplify the history by skipping 1,000 years. I don't know how that works. But that's why I thought this is important to make people realize that there's another narrative out there, and there's another history, and that the civilization, the science today, is built on the shoulders of those in the past.
Christie, how about you? Why this book? Why now?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess why now was just that I used to be an elite athlete, and so I was very interested in recovery at that time. But in the time period between when I, ended my elite athletic career and now, there seems to have been this rise of what I like to think of as the recovery industrial complex. Like there's all of these products and things that have sprung up, marketed at athletes, and so it was kind of a coming together of two sides of my life, the athleticism and then science journalism. And so it was really a chance to, I had sort of found a vehicle to indulge this obsession of mine with the scientific method and sort of teaching people about assessing these kinds of claims and why you can't trust all of the headlines that you see about science and things like this. And I want to be really clear, I'm not talking about promoting skepticism of science as a process, but maybe skepticism of results as they are often presented to the public. But I guess I would just say, though, I feel like this session is sort of, probably a lot of you are here to sort of hear about the process and things like that, and I would just say that the only reason to write a book is because you can't not write it, because it's really, really hard, and all of us are now on the other side of it, but while you're in it, it can be really miserable at times. It's very lonely. You're very much on your own. It's not very collaborative. I have a fantastic editor who is great, but sort of aside from him, I was really in it alone, and so you really have to make sure that you're choosing a topic that you can sit with for in a very extended period of time.
I promise we'll get to the process. That's our next round of questions. But
sorry, I didn't mean to skip ahead.
No, that's good. Thomas, why this book? Why now? Why you?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's really one I'm really enjoying listening to Rana and then Christie, because clearly everybody's got their own reason for doing this, right? And they come from very different places, and there's something within each of us that says, do this. It's not going to be nice, it's not going to be fun, but you've got to do this. So I'm a journalist, and I think all of us are, and so really, why should a journalist write a book? And I think for me, the reason is it flowed from the same reason that I wanted to be a journalist. And that which is basically, first of all, for myself to understand the world, make sense of the world, and then try and, spread my sense, if you will, or help other people to make sense of the world. And you can do this. I was a news reporter for many years, but there's some stories that are so big that 500 words, 1,000 words, a 2,000, even a 10,000 word piece in the New Yorker or an entire series is not going to do justice to this. Ultimately, all of us, I think, and basically, I think one of the reasons was to record history as it was happening. Because that's one of the things that we all want to do. Something longer than a newspaper article, but we're not historians, but we want to capture things as they happen or shortly after they've happened and to try and make sense of them, build narratives around this. So why did I write this book now? Well, books beget books. And so I wrote this book because I wrote an earlier book. And that earlier book was about another disease. It was SARS, which like some of you, I'm sure some of you probably remember this, but it swept southern China, Hong Kong, and large parts of the world in 2002, 2003. This was a viral disease, a new virus that emerged out of nowhere. And its impact was frightening. I mean, it shut down cities. Science struggled to make sense of all of this. And I was living in Hong Kong at that time. I was a journalist. A publisher wanted a quick story on this, so I knew nothing about science or viruses. I used to write about politics and global trade and stuff like that. So I immersed myself, talked to virologists, read virology textbooks, plus did all the things that reporters also do to try and make sense of this new disease. And that was a much quicker book. That opened up an interest in science and health in particular. I worked briefly at the WHO for a year in 2009. I was going back to the university in 2010, and I heard about the polio program, which was supposed to end in 2012. And I thought, hey, I've got 2 years, time for a second book, 2 years, I can do this, right? Once more, just record what has happened, and it'll be an easy, happy book to do. It wasn't. It's still going on now. But I think this is really what drives me to write a book, and I'm sure this strikes a chord amongst many of you here in the audience. And that is really to make sense of what's happening. People tell you all sorts of things. Some sense, a lot of it is nonsense. Things don't add up. You get all these data points all over the world, all over the place, and you want to link this. You want to make sense of this. For your own satisfaction. Ultimately, I think it has to come for your own satisfaction because you want to do this. And it's a long, lonely process. And Christie, as an athlete, you probably find strong parallels between, endurance running.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is. It's a marathon, not a sprint. That's for sure.
So I am definitely sympathetic to the feeling that the story you are writing in your book is changing as you are writing it. My book, Plucked, which David mentioned, I thought when I signed the contract for it that it was going to take 2 years, and it took 4, and I had to keep rewriting the last third of it because news kept happening, which was extremely irritating. Okay, so I promised we're going to talk about process, but I want to ask David one more question first, and that is, David, all of the people here on this stage they're all writing books about science, but they're all really in different genres. I mean, Rana's book is partly memoir. Christie's is a very syncretic book of lots of research. Thomas is writing journalism and modern day history. Do you have any sense of, is the market more or less friendly to any particular genre of science writing?
I think you're right in that all 3 books are in a different genre, but at their heart, they're stories about people, and that's what people will engage with. And even the really big ideas books, they come down to stories. I mean, I guess the elephant in the room is *Sapiens*, which is it's the best-selling non-fiction or non-celebrity non-fiction book of the past decade, I think, and it's so much rooted in story and lots of different stories, and it's a collage. But I think you can't write a book that isn't story-driven. Well, you can, but that's not what the market wants. And we see those books, those big books like *Sapiens*, often have a sort of predecessor. So in some respects, *Sapiens* is a reworking of *The Penguin History of the World*, which was published in the 70s and still sells today. And similarly, Adam Rutherford's book, A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived, he wouldn't mind me saying that is picking up where Steve Jones left off in The Language of Genes. And these big books, they're always in conversation with other books. And that's a way in, I think. The other thing that at the moment is doing really well, and you wouldn't necessarily group them together, but I think it's interesting to do so, is books that are things that people, it's like you knew this at school, but you've forgotten it now. So for a general readership, the Carlo Rovelli books, 7 Brief Lessons on Physics, does that brilliantly. And do you know Matt Parker, the mathematician? He's written a book recently. He's done several books, but his most recent one is called Humble Pie, P-I. And those books look very different. They're marketed totally differently. Matt Parker's book is very comedic and sort of aimed at a general reader. But they're doing the same thing. It's telling people not to be afraid of science, and I think there's definitely a trend towards that at the moment.
So I promised we'd get to process, and this is the moment. So any of you jump in. Literally, how do you do this? Because I think everyone does have a different process. Do you hit the road for 2 years? Do you write things on index cards and stash them in a shoebox somewhere? How do you undertake the research that allows you to put 100,000 words on paper?
The research is the easy part.
The research is the fun part.
For me, that's the fun part. It's the writing. That's really hard. And I know I've heard from other writers, I do think process is super individual. And I imagine that it probably varies by book. I mean, Maryn, you've written multiple books and probably used different processes for each. But I've heard other writers say that they write as they go along, and I couldn't do that because I spent much more time researching than I did writing, but in between those two, I spent a lot of time not writing and trying to figure out what the hell this was and how I was going to put it together and how this was all going to be some sort of cohesive narrative. Because the thing about a book is it can't just be 12 magazine articles. It can't just be like unified pieces of the story. It needs to have some kind of narrative drive. It needs to have a narrative arc. And that can be really difficult, actually, I think, with perhaps, maybe this is something you can speak to, but with science books, because you have to have some sense that you're building on something and you're going somewhere, and that was really challenging for my book.
So, Rana, what do you think about that?
So actually, this is my first book, by the way. So I'm a scientist, and I write a lot of peer-reviewed journal articles. So this was my first experience. And I think it first started out, as I had told you earlier, that I wanted to redefine what success means. So I had compiled over 100 interviews of different people. And my idea at first was to put all those in one book. So I took a year off. I went to the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard, so I could, have the time and the space and the resources to actually sit down and write this. And actually, it was there that each one of us fellows had to present what their book they were writing about. And I presented a 40-minute talk of what I envisioned my book to do, and which was a compilation of all these narratives of the different interviews and finding a common thread among them, that as women and men around the world, we kind of suffer the same challenges, and I could find a kind of let's say, a light that connects us all to find a solution. For people to follow their passion. So when I presented this data all excited, I had all the social scientists actually jumping on me, telling me, you can't do that. And I said, why not? They said, because you're not a social scientist. Mm-hmm. You're a biologist, and you don't have the right, quote unquote. And it wasn't said that in my face, but you could understand the message. And I said, but I have a methodology. I'm a scientist. I followed a methodology. But they were very much against it. But there was another reason that I discovered, and that's what really helped me write the book, is that they I was talking about women all over the world, West and East, because that was the research I had done. they did not, they meaning this collective fellows, mostly Western, they did not accept that a woman coming from the Middle East could have an opinion about Western women. It was too much, I think. But it was okay for a Western guy to have an opinion on the Middle East. That was okay. But for me to do it, that was like, they told me literally, why don't you just write about women in the Middle East? Why do you have to include all women? And that's what made me know, you know what, and they told me, but other people advised me, if you're going to write this book, write it from your perspective, write your memoir, and write your opinion. That way you could get the message out, but nobody can actually put you in a corner and say, you don't have the credibility, you don't have the credentials. And that's what made me write the memoir. And it was that kind of feeling of responsibility that I had to get it out. And I was actually just writing from my heart. I would sit down, being upset with what's going on, and I want to share my story. That made me actually write it down to share it. And it made me think that's why much more people need to write regardless of the people around them. So now that this book is out and it's got very good reviews, it was reviewed in Nature, now I'm ready to write the first book that I was going to write, which is compiling all those interviews and putting them down. So this is an invitation if anybody wants to be a partner with me writing the second book. Everybody's open.
Meet us at the side of the stage after the session.
And actually, in this book that I wrote, I quote Toni Morrison, how she said when she wrote her book, it was a book that embraces you and slaps you. So actually my book is kind of the same. It embraces and it slaps. So some people are going to like it, some people are not. Some parts you're going to like and some parts you're not. But we need to be honest with each other and have a good conversation.
So you're describing a process of working out of material that you had been gathering for a while. But Thomas, it sounds like you were in the opposite position because what you thought your story was, as you just described, changed literally as you were researching the book. So how did you deal with that?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, the research took a long, this is a slim book, it comes in at 80,000 words, and I've done the 40,000 words I discarded. And I think we should talk about narrative and structure also, because that's really, at some stage, that's important. I took about 6 to 7 years, actually, to figure out all these different parts in the puzzle, and then maybe about 6 to 7 months to write it, but to understand it, to get a narrative thread. A lot of it was just understanding. So I was a biology student at times, because if the polio virus is one of the characters in my book, I need to understand what this thing is. What does it do? What does it look like? How does it behave? All the things that you would, if you're writing about somebody, you would do exactly the same thing. So I talked to virologists, I read articles in the Lancet, as much of the literature, the scientific literature. Here's the great thing about science journalism, a lot of it is there, it's recorded. And if you have the patience really to go to PubMed or to any database, you can get every bit of scientific evidence that's ever been written about any subject under the sun. So that took a long time, sort of going through, and one journal leads to another journal, one footnote leads to another footnote, and I think any academic researcher can understand that. The second was a historian. Say, the other people involved. Albert Sabin, for example, the creator of the oral polio vaccine. He was an amazing character. He was this typical irascible genius. Nobody could talk to him. You could not argue with him. He would never take no for an answer. He was Albert Sabin. He was a genius, right? So I wanted to get under the skin of this guy as well. And there, luckily, was his correspondence at the University of Cincinnati. There was wonderful digital archives. So I dived into his letters, and luckily he lived in an age where people wrote letters to each other. Everything was done. There were no emails. There were very few phone calls. So he wrote. He fought with people very publicly by letter. Then I went to records of old meetings of the WHO, the first debates on the polio vaccine. Is this a safe vaccine? So I found all of that. Luckily, it's all available, but it takes a while. So you get this huge sort of mountain of stuff. And this is the clay from which you try and mold, a serviceable pot or whatever it is. But the main thing has really been to make things come alive. And to do that, you really need to get under the skin of whatever it is, even if it's a polio virus, whether it's a human being. So that requires a lot of research. And the third part was the easiest for me, that is doing what a journalist do. Go to Nigeria, I went to Pakistan, I went with the polio team, I talked to people who were refusing vaccine, I talked to people whose relatives had been assassinated for vaccinating. So that was another part. This was also a geopolitical story. So I did what every journalist does, go and see things, touch things, feel things, poke them to make sure that they're real. So that was the information gathering thing. And then the hard thing after that was really to build a narrative, because all of us are storytellers. So what's the story here? And it was really hard because you needed to puncture an existing story, which was that polio had already disappeared. And if you ask anybody, does polio, polio, I thought that had gone already. Or they've got pictures of Rotarians, putting drops of polio vaccines into the mouths of smiling babies in Asia and Africa. That's the other dominant thing. There's this do-good thing that polio is gone, and oh yeah, maybe there's some problem, but it's going to go by next year, and we're getting there. This is a great triumph. It wasn't a triumph. It's not yet a triumph. And so a lot of it really was to get a narrative that would be true to that would accurately reflect the enormous gains, the huge scientific work that had gone into this, the enormous amount that polio eradication has actually achieved. It's gone from large parts of the world. So have all of that, but also make it very clear that this is not the kind of success that is being sort of trumpeted all around. And I needed a narrative form that would do that. I needed to get a voice. Voice is relatively easy, but really the narrative, is it going to be a linear narrative? This happened, this happened, this happened, this happened? That didn't work here because you say this happened, and then at this point, people suddenly realize something about this point, which meant that everything changed. So how do we put all of this together? What is going to be the thread which is going to link chapter? How do you chapterize? I took a long time. I had a prologue. What do I put in the prologue? Right? And the prologue later became a much later chapter. So there was this constant reworking, probably obsessive reworking. And this is the baby that was born at the end of this all.
So, David, listening to all of these authors talk about the very different processes by which that produce their manuscripts, as an editor, how do you work with an author while this is going on? Do you leave them alone? Do you call them every week?
We have to be chameleons. I think such a big part of our job is working out what the author wants. And sometimes they'll tell us, and they'll say, and whether it's leave me alone, I've signed the contract, I'll give you a manuscript in a year or 5. But there's one author I'm working with at the moment, and we're sort of in the final stages of getting his manuscript ready. And over the past month, I've spent a day a week at his house. We're going through the pages with him because that's how he wants to work. And I do speak to him every day. I haven't for the year and a half that he's been writing the book, but sort of in those moments. And yeah, I think whenever anyone is dealing with an editor, don't be shy to say, I want this kind of support, or back off. Equally, if it's someone who says, here's the manuscript, publish it, being able to push back is really important, and we want to find a process that's best for the author, but also best for the book. You don't want to publish something that's that
so you're really a psychologist.
A psychologist.
Yeah, working out what your author's unconscious needs and desires are.
Yeah, counselor maybe.
So I do have to ask also, because you are, in a way, you are the most important person on the stage here, because you are the person that decides whether these manuscripts actually become physical objects to be purchased in the marketplace or not. We live now in a non-text world in many ways. In a world of YouTube and Insta and TikTok, and a world in which more and more media companies are, quote, pivoting to video, unquote. And here all of us represent not just the text, but really large amounts of text, often without any pictures. So could you talk for a minute about literally how you keep the flag flying for books?
Well, I mean, we're an organization of 140 people who are extremely passionate about those big chunks of text. That's what we've grown up with, what we want to push, and that is the starting point. We're excited by those things, and obviously the vast majority of our authors are as well, and so there's that sense of a team coming together right from the start. But what we do see other media companies as, you know, as much competition as we do other publishing companies, but we're also very much looking to work with those, to interact with those. So many, especially in science books, proposals come in with a link to a TED Talk already on YouTube. I think yours did, Maryn. And that's great, and it's really helpful in terms of sharing. We have to share our material with sales departments in the building and around the world, and having those extra things are really useful at that stage. And then when it comes to publication, to get journalists interested in doing publicity for the book, and to sell the book to people. And there's definitely a mutual beneficial relationship with YouTube in particular. People are also publishing in really interesting ways. So have you seen the Greta Thunberg book, No One is Too Small to Make a Difference? And the Penguin published it. It's a tiny $2.99 paperback. I think it's about 80 pages in this small format. And it's been out for a month and it sold 25,000 copies. And I was at a literary festival last month. She wasn't there, and the bookshop at this festival had stocked the book, and people were just picking it up at the till and adding it to their pile of books. And she's got a longer, a 100,000-word book coming out either the end of this year or start of next. And those 25,000 people who read that book are already engaged with her as a writer. And I think that's just a really smart bit of publishing. But at the same time, people like a challenge sometimes. I was looking at last week's top bestsellers in science books, and again, slightly depressing, but number 10 was A Brief History of Time, which was published 30 years ago. But people continue to want to be challenged by that book. And I mean,
that's the book that everyone's bought and no one's ever finished,
exactly.
right? Yeah.
And so, I mean, the same in economics.
Like Ulysses for physics.
Yeah, and Thomas Piketty, Tim Harford, the statistician, said, somebody asked him at an event, why is everyone reading Thomas Piketty? And he said, well, everyone's reading Thomas Piketty because everyone's reading Thomas Piketty. And there's this, when things become part of the conversation like that, people will go to a difficult chunk of text in that instance and have a go at it. And I think we can still foster those kinds of books.
So hold that thought, because there's one more thing that I want to ask you. But we are closing in on the end of the session, and it looks to me like plenty of people are still looking up and are engaged with us, and so I'm guessing you have questions. And so please start thinking about your questions, because there's going to be an opportunity to ask them for at least 10 minutes, and there will be, if you have strong voices, you can just stand up and shout, but there will be a couple of mics circulating through the audience. So we're going to do a lightning round. I want to start with you, David. But from each of you, for just a minute or two, I would like to hear pretty much your one piece of advice for people who aspire to be writing science books themselves. Start with you, David.
I think it's partly been covered, but write what you're excited about. Don't ever ignore everything I've said, and don't try and write to a market. You need to tell the story that you need to tell. Partly because, as you say, you'll be with it for a very long time. by yourself. But also it comes across in the writing when we're not looking for books that are in a particular genre, on a particular subject. We're looking for the books where someone is so enthusiastic that they want to share that idea, and that is what's infectious. And that's what excites us. To an extent, we are the first general reader of a book. We don't have any expertise in science, in history, in politics. We want to see passion and an eagerness to explain a topic for a general audience. So be passionate.
Rana, if someone wanted to do what you did, what would you tell them?
So two pieces of advice. One, as a biologist, I envision in the past millennia, there were actually two groups of people. A group of people sitting around a fire telling a story, and those who didn't, and frowned upon those who were telling stories that, oh, you're wasting your time. But you can imagine which one of the groups is the one that survived today. It was the storytellers. So storytelling is so powerful, it's part of evolution. So what I tell everybody, that everybody's unique. First in your DNA, nobody's DNA is like the other, so every person is unique. Even identical twins are different because of epigenetics. So you are different and you're unique, and that's why I ask everybody, I tell this to my students, write your story. You don't have to be famous, you don't have to do great things. You are great as you are, and you owe it to write that story to others. So to go out there and write your story, and just write from your heart, as you said, I think that's very, very important.
Christie, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I gave my best advice already, which is don't write a book unless you can't not write it. But I think a corollary to that is that write the book that's your book and not the thing that you think is going to sell, and don't look at the market and think, okay, I'm going to write my version of this other book. I mean, it really does have to be something that's your own obsession, or you're just never going to make it through the process without hating yourself and hating the book. And I think that good books come out of good, people that really care about the topic. You'll write a much better book if it's something you're passionate about. So you really do have to have that passion for the subject. And I think it's really good. One other bit of advice, and I guess this is not so much for process, except the end of the process. Before the book came out, and as I was finishing it, I thought long and hard about what would make this, what is my objective with this book? What will it take for me to feel like it was successful? What is that metric going to be? And what I decided is I wanted to finish the process and have a book that I was proud of and that I felt like I could stand behind, and that was really representing the best research that was out there. And I did that. And so then at that point, it didn't matter what happened and how many copies it sold or anything like that, because I had met my own metric and I could feel good about it. But I think that that's an important thing that now that I've done it, I can imagine thinking about that from the onset. What am I trying to do here? What will success look like? What do I need to do to get there?
Thomas.
Yeah. I think it's really important. If you want to write a book, please do it. I think it's really important because if people in this audience don't write about science, who is going to? And science is important. If you just look at the gap between the public and science, it's huge, and we are the only people, those of us sitting in this room and elsewhere, of course, are the only people who can do it. Having said which, this is why people should write books. Having said which, I can only second you need to be passionate about it. You need to be enthusiastic about it. One of the things that I do is I don't write books about things I already know something about. I tend to write books about things I find fascinating but which I know nothing about, which is why it takes me a long time. So it's also a voyage of discovery for me. And that is one of the reasons that my next book, what I'm thinking of, is something completely different. It's about food and how we are going to feed ourselves in 10 years down the road with climate change and all, because this is something that's really intrigued me. And I want to try and understand this, and there's science in that as well. But the point I'm trying to make is I don't write about things I already know about. I try and write about things that I don't know about, which is what keeps that spark going, the enthusiasm going, but also makes it 100 times more difficult. And the other thing that Christie mentioned, and I think, Rana, you've also been alluding to it, is that you really need to set a bar for yourself. What is it that I'm trying to achieve? Never embark on anything in life without knowing what you want to achieve. And the achievement is, it could be as simple as finishing the book, but I don't think that's really going to keep you going through this long process. And I didn't quite get it, was I wanted to get at least, well, I did make it, at least to get nominated for one of the big prizes. And this got on the long list for something called the Welcome Prize. So I'll be open with you. I wanted to get at least on the short list for one of the big prizes, but at least I got on the long list. So that was what motivated me. I want a book that is good enough to get, at least to get on the list of one of these big prizes. Because that sets a bar for yourself in terms of quality, in terms of what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, what is enough, how much more time do I need to, get this paragraph right, and so on and so forth.
Congratulations.
Congratulations, that is fantastic. And I do not mean to be a naysayer here, but I think that's a terrible goal because it's something that is out of your control. I say this in all earnestness, I think that it's better to set a goal. I would like my book to be recognized, or I would like it to be well reviewed or something like this, but I think it's really, and I say this particularly in the book publishing industry, which is so there's a randomness about it. I mean, you can write the best book out there, and I've seen friends do this, and for factors that have nothing to do with the quality of your writing or the book or whatever, it sinks. And you don't get nominated for the prize or whatever. And so I think it's really important for sustainability, but also just for your mental health and all of this, to set goals that are, you can say that you want to have recognition, and that's much broader. But when you say, I want this book to win a Pulitzer Prize, you're pretty much setting yourself up for disappointment. Your book is obviously really good.
Okay, so we're ending on a note of both triumph and a plea for mental health, and now it's your turn. So I am sure that people here have questions for the authors or the editor, and we do have, let's see, let me see, I do see the hands that were just put up. Okay, so you can take that one, and I will stand up here. Okay, and I think there's one more. Is there one more mic? Did we have one more mic somewhere? No, I thought the booth had another mic for us. They may be coming down with it. Show me again who had their hands up. All right. Oops. Oh, now that one's open. Okay, one. Okay. All right, sorry. One, and then two. And then, I'm just telling you in which order you're going to go. Okay. And then in the shawl, you'll be number 3. Okay. Go ahead. Ask your question, please.
Okay, so I have a question about, at the very end, Christie touched a little bit on the realities of the publishing market, but before we've been hearing a lot about, passion and following your heart and everything like that. And so you follow your heart, you have your passion, you write a great book, and then you start talking to publishers, and they start talking about something called platform, for example, and which basically means do you have this YouTube channel? Do you have the Twitter followers? And do you have a PhD? And suddenly this passion and quality of the book kind of goes backward, to the back, and everything is about platform. So can you tell us more about exactly having this platform, and what do you do if you do have passion, you write a great book, but your platform is not there? You don't have, a great YouTube channel, you don't have a PhD. So should you get a PhD? Should you start a YouTube channel? Should you have your Facebook followers? What do you do?
David, I think that's for you.
All that stuff it's incredibly helpful, but I don't think it's essential. And I think especially the people in this room, the journalists, that is a great platform to start with. And any writing you can do, and even if you're not a journalist, even if you're doing a blog, just building that from scratch it's all useful. But I don't think any of it is essential. We have authors who won't touch social media, and that's fine. I mean, our salespeople would certainly like it if they did, but there are also Twitter accounts that are wildly misleading. Twitter accounts that have sort of stagnated. So numbers of followers, I don't think is hugely important.
That was just my experience. So my book did sell to Little and Brown, but before I actually heard when my agent was selling my book from certain publishers that, okay, I absolutely love the book, it's a great book, but she's just a journalist. And so I actually heard comments like that it's such a bad thing to be just a journalist.
Yeah, I don't think we've ever turned down a book.
Okay, you didn't, but...
Just a journalist, but...
Yeah? Okay, let's move on to the next question.
I was wondering about the realities of writing a book when you've got a day job, because I've got this fantasy of renting a cabin by a lake and 4 months of just intense writing, and I don't think anybody can really do that. So how do you fit it in to your real life?
Okay, so that's for the authors. Who wants to start?
Yeah.
Christie?
I can take that. So I wrote my book while I was the lead author, or the lead science writer at 538, and it was the hardest thing I've ever done. Like, I promised my husband I wouldn't do that again, because it meant that evenings and weekends, like for what felt like forever, belonged to the book. And like, I didn't have a personal life, and it was really hard. And I did have some time off that I was taking, and I took a very short book leave, which was not nearly long enough. And then at the end, I did take like a short, I went and did a retreat at a friend's house to just get the very last part done, but it was really hard, and I think it's a really tricky thing to do. The problem with writing a book is that it's not something, I mean, I don't know, maybe it's just me, and this may vary a little bit by the genre of the book and the way that you're writing it, but I found, at least for me, it was very, very difficult to just write the book like an hour a day or something, or even if I had been able to have one day a week, I think it would have been really difficult, because the thing about the book is you sort of have to be in the obsession, and you need like extended time with that. And the problem is, I think actually if you're going to have another job, it needs to be something that's not writing. Like for me, writing is like running. I can't have my day job be to run 10Ks every day and then go home at night and run a marathon. Like there's only so much writing that I have in me, but also, you need this attention, and you need so much of the writing process is just sort of ruminating on things and letting things percolate and having this time, and that's something that's very difficult to condense. I don't think that's impossible, but it takes a lot of self-discipline and planning to make that work.
Does anybody want to answer?
In my case, actually, it takes much longer. So I worked full-time. I taught at university. I ran a program there and so on. Which is why, part of the reason why this took so long, because I had the day job, but I was fortunate. For example, I could teach Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday was book. And then between semesters, I could travel. So I was really lucky in that way of being able to, sort of manage both. But it is a full-time job, and especially towards the end, it is, it's 7 days a week. Sundays was half day, but otherwise it was sort of making sure that I used to nail myself to my chair at 9 in the morning and not allow myself to go home until later.
There's also sort of this psychological component that I think is important to consider, which is that it's always hanging over your head, even if you've deliberately decided, like, I'm taking Sundays off or whatever, like, it's just always there, and it's this feeling, like, and you really realize this once it's done, and you're like, oh my God, I forgot what this feels like.
To have an entire day off, right. You had a question.
I imagine with Rana's book is a very personal book, so I think this question is mainly for Christine and for Thomas. When you're writing a book like Good to Go or Polio, how much of you is in the book, and how much do you try to separate yourself and your feelings and your stand? I mean, is it important that you separate it, or do you accept that you are going to be a presence in it?
Okay, that's an interesting question, and the answer changed. At one level, everything of me is in this book. It reflects my values, right? In terms of what I think is right, and there's that, all of that is sort of the undercurrent of the book. Because it wouldn't, unless I think it's true for any author, it's really part of you is in this book. It reflects who you are, the way it's written, the subjects, the way you talk about different things, it reflects your values. At a more technical level, the question is, does the first person singular ever come into this? Is there an I person in this? Initially, there was no I in this, and I thought that was really boring. And so, it's also to vary the voice. It's also a technical thing. So I put myself into various places that I had actually done reporting or people that I had talked to. I would bring myself into it. But that was more, I think, an effort to, in terms of narrative, in terms of pacing, in terms of, bringing human beings, 2 pages with no human beings in it. And here I am just sitting there doing nothing, so I'm there. So that's really...
Christie.
Yeah, I think really the way to think about this is how will you best serve your audience? But there's kind of 2 parts of this, though. So what's the best way to serve your audience is one, but also what kind of book are you trying to write? And you should make the decision just based on what you think people would like. It should also go back to what am I trying to do here? But so for me, I did not want to write a book that was I tried these things or I did this. I didn't want it to be about me. But it ended up, in the course of reporting it, I tried all kinds of weird things. And so I put those in there because that was sort of a way of, this goes back to what you were saying about stories, really having some stories about what these techniques and these things were like. And it also sort of gave me insights into why some of these things were so popular if the science showed that they weren't working. And so my first draft, I had quite a few of these scenes, but I kept them very short, and I didn't want to put myself in it, and I did not want it to be about me. And in the end, the book is definitely not about me, and there are chapters that I don't appear in. But the first draft, my editor, basically everywhere I appeared, he just circled it and said more, he wanted more of that. And it's been really interesting when I get feedback from readers. One of the things that has been almost universal is people say, oh, I love the scenes of you trying stuff. So that was really interesting, but that was something that was serving the reader. So I wasn't doing it you should never put yourself in there to show off or show how smart you are or to give an opinion just to give it unless it's really relevant. But I think just going back to the audience and asking, how is this serving the thing that I'm trying to do?
Can I comment on that just really quickly?
Quick.
Very quick. Even in science journal, scientific articles, there's the change to write in the I, by the way. Mm-hmm. Not just say in the third person as in the past. So it is important to get the person engaged.
Thank you. We have time for one more question.
I'm just curious about the experience of writing books that's not English, for non-native speakers of English. Whether from publishing from speakers or writers who are not native speakers of English, is there a market for this? Do you know is there a space for this?
I'm assuming the question is for me, right? So you're saying since my first language is Arabic and I'm writing in another language, you mean? How is that? Or so to me, I'll just tell you about my experience, and maybe David can. I don't know if you do any non-English, but I wanted to write in the language I felt comfortable with, and I felt more comfortable writing in English. Actually, I don't know if anybody's read Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. Yeah, so his voice was in my head when I was writing. I was actually using his technique of writing as if I was in a conversation with my reader. And I think that helped me write, even though maybe I don't know how to write in a narrative in English, but if it's telling a story and having a conversation, I'm good at that. And that's what helped me do it. And now we're actually translating it at least into Arabic. But again, I'm translating it with someone, but to make sure that my voice is in there. I don't know if that helped to answer.
David, do you have any thoughts quickly about selling books in other than English, which is that's a rights question?
We only publish in English. We sell translation rights and we buy translation rights. I'm struggling to think of a writer we publish where English isn't. We publish in English, and they've written the book in English when English isn't their first language.
Let me reframe the question, because we actually were asked this question at another conference I was at recently, which is there any hope for an author who starts out not in English? For instance,
absolutely. I mean, if the book comes in and it's a brilliant idea and compellingly told, it doesn't matter. We spelling and grammar and all that stuff, that's easy. We do that at the end. But the ideas are the most important things, the stories. So yeah, don't be put off by a lack of confidence in English, because I mean that's what we're here for.
I'm going to end it there on the story is the most important thing. We are out of time. It's coffee break next, so if you would like to come up and speak to the panelists, we all have some stretch in our schedules, but in the meantime, please join me in thanking them.